Test, 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 test.
Sure.
Testing 1, 2, 3. Testing the mic. Good.
You push that button now.
Green to pressure.
I don't think we're gonna have a lot of drama today.
No.
The Executive Overreach Task Force will come to order, and without objection, the chair is authorized to declare recess of the task force at any time. I'll recognize myself for opening statement. Today's hearing will focus on executive overreach in foreign affairs. The Constitution grants the President, as Commander-in-Chief, clear powers in foreign affairs. However, the Constitution also provides for a check on those powers by, for example, requiring that the Senate approve international treaties and that Congress appropriate all funds needed to foreign military engagements. I'll focus my remarks today on two troubling developments as it relates to those checks the Constitution grants the Congress and not the President. Regarding the Senate's treaty ratification powers, in Paris late last year, the Obama administration also took part in the 21st Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change. Senior administration officials, including Secretary of State John Kerry, Environmental Protection Agency Administrator Gina McCarthy, and Secretary of Energy Ernest Moniz, who visited Ames, Iowa just this past week, and I thank him for that, negotiated the final terms of a new climate change pact, the so-called Paris Agreement. The agreement involves the commitments that will affect every part of the U.S., and the Obama administration intends to meet those commitments by requiring changes to state law. These Paris Agreement criteria and others listed by the State Department itself in what's called the Circular 175 procedure show clearly that the Paris Agreement is a treaty that requires the approval of the Senate under Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2 of the Constitution, which provides the President shall have power by and with the advice and consent of the Senate to make treaties provided two-thirds of the senators present concur. Despite this, President Obama has made clear through his spokesperson that he has no intention of consulting or including either the Senate or anyone in Congress in any aspect of the international treaty. On March 31st, 2015, White House spokesman Josh Earnest was asked at a press conference briefing whether Congress has the right to approve the Paris Agreement. Mr. Earnest responded, speaking for the President, as follows, quote, "I think it's hard to take seriously from some members of Congress who deny the fact that climate change exists that they should have some opportunity to render judgment about a climate change agreement." Now think of that for a moment. The chief spokesperson of the President of the United States said that simply because members of Congress might disagree with the President's environmental policies, the constitutional requirement that a treaty be submitted to the Senate for approval is negated. That's outrageous and it's unlawful, and it's a clear example of the executive overreach in the area of foreign affairs. Regarding the President's powers in war, the President does have much greater constitutional authority in the areas of military affairs than he does in domestic affairs. Yet even in the case of war, the President's powers are not unlimited. One clear limitation on that power is Congress's constitutional authority to appropriate all federal funds for use on anything, including war. Yet President Obama has evaded Congress's control over military appropriations, as many presidents have, by using accounting gimmicks to move funds Congress approved for one purpose to another, as was done to pay for the U.S. intervention in Libya. Today, Congress's power of the purse is weakened because the President has many ways to evade Congress's control over military appropriations, namely accounting procedures to move funds Congress approved for one purpose to another purpose Congress has not approved. In the case of the intervention in Libya, President Obama paid for that conflict entirely out of funds reallocated from other Defense Department accounts. Harold Koh, President Obama's own former legal advisor to the Department of State, has also written that the President has developed over time a whole range of devices to exploit spending loopholes in the appropriation process. When Congress grants the President statutory drawdown authority, he may withdraw certain funds simply by determining that such withdrawals are vital to the security of the United States. Similar statutory provisions allow the President access to special and contingency funds based upon nebulous findings that the use of those funds is important to the security of the United States or to the national interest. When given statutory transfer and reprogramming authority, the President transfers to one appropriations account funds initially appropriated for another, or may reprogram appropriated funds within a single appropriation account, often without specific statutory authority. This is yet another example of executive overreach, albeit one that Congress has been complicit to some extent. Nevertheless, it's an issue that this task force should consider. And I also am thinking about the Iranian treaty agreement, and I expect there will be some remarks with regard to that a little bit later today. And I would point out that Congress has controlled funds with regard to war and done so effectively, and if one would read back through the appropriations debate and language that shut off all funds to support the Vietnam War in the land of Vietnam and the seas adjacent to it, the skies over it, or the countries adjacent to or the skies over them, no funds would be used to conduct a Vietnam War. And it's effectively, I'll say, de facto took ammunition off the docks at Da Nang by an act of Congress by using the appropriations language to shut down a war. So that's an example of how a president did honor the wishes of Congress, and we're going to want to talk today about that. But in the meantime, I look forward to hearing from all of our witnesses here today on these and many other issues, and I would recognize the ranking member, Mr. Cohen from Tennessee, for his opening statement.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would first like to submit for the record my prepared remarks, which I will not refer to in my remarks for entry into the record.
So, without objection, so ordered.
Thank you. I was a little bit late today, for I was at the Trumpo show, and there's a gigantic crowd of reporters and television and protesters over at the Republican, wherever y'all meet, that one of those places. I saw Vice President Issa over there, and he was walking down the street looking very vice presidential. He was ready at any minute to step in.
I don't know. You were the one in the Cadillac driving by.
I thought it was Scherzer. There were so many people. I thought it was something to do with Scherzer. I mean, he had 20 strikeouts, but I found out it was Trump. Scherzer, yeah, unbelievable last night. But you think you got a problem with executive overreach now. If he becomes president, you got comb over, overreach, you got all kind of overs and no unders.
Does a gentleman pretend to know something about hair? Is there a level of expertise being asserted here in the halls of Congress?
I have to admit I have hair envy. There's no question about it. But if you think you got problems with President Obama, if there's a President Trump, the Congress will hardly exist because it'll be huge. And he'll do great things, and he won't need anybody's advice or consent because he does great things and he's got great people. And, you know, we will truly be like we are today. Here we are pretending to do government, and nobody's really here, and everybody's watching the show. And we're not the show. It's all going to be a show. And you think, you know, an executive, a businessman, a billionaire, he's not going to care about Congress because he does it all. And if we suggest anything that he's overreaching his power, he'll fire us. So there'll be nothing happening. But it's a wonderful story that's about to happen on the Republican side. It's going to be a story that people are going to look at for centuries. And children in Eastern Europe are going to know they can be born there, in Eastern Europe, to parents who are economically deprived, and they can become a model and turn out to be First Lady of the United States. And it's going to give children in Eastern Europe something to look forward to. It's going to incentivize them and give them hope. And it's going to be a great day for America. I can see it coming. But I don't, you know, as far as overreach, you're going to have overreach. It's going to make Obama look like the person that Mr. King would like to have as president, somebody who was just strictly limited to the confines of Article, is it 2? Yeah. And doesn't do anything at all that infringes on Article 1. So with that,
Would the gentleman yield?
the gentleman will yield to the vice president.
I think the gentleman and I will remember that.
Don't tell Mr. Corker I called you vice president.
The case we're making here today hopefully plays right into what you just said, that if we anticipate that there have been or measure that there have been overreaches under this administration and anticipate under the next administration, then wouldn't the gentleman agree that legislation that specifically empowers the House to be a more effective balancing act over executive overreach would be paramount right now before the great hair revolution begins?
I don't disagree with you. And in a lot of ways, as a lifetime legislator, 24 years in the state and now 9 plus here, I agree the legislature should have more power. And that I disagree that President Obama has overreached on climate change, which does exist, and or on the Iran nuclear agreement, which keeps us safer from the destruction of the planet and mankind. And Mr. Bellinger and Mr. Goldsmith, two of the legal minds in the Bush administration who I have great regard for, concur in that these were authorized and appropriate. But I do think there are problems that have occurred in other areas where the executive has gone further than they should in doing things that were legislative prerogatives. And I think that if by some chance Mr. Trump is the president, that all gone, it's over.
Well, I look forward to working with the gentleman to pass that legislation under the current administration so that all future Congresses will enjoy that protection against overreach that the gentleman agrees can occur and has occurred, and that this special working group is all about.
Would this be kind of like passing a bill that is like putting an alarm on the government that will go off and let us know that when somebody's trying to break the rules, and that alarm goes off and warns us?
I hope it's both an alarm and an auto shutdown capability. Thank you.
I yield back.
The gentleman's time has expired, and the chair now recognizes the chairman of the full committee, Mr. Goodlatte from Virginia, for his opening statement.
Well, thank you, Chairman King, for convening this third hearing of the Task Force on Executive Overreach, and I've been very interested to hear the dialogue I've just heard, and especially the comments of the ranking member, because I look forward to the transition that will take place when we have a bipartisan effort to halt executive overreach, because it occurs in every administration of both parties. It's occurring right now, and the point isn't whether you believe in a particular point of view about climate change or whether you believe in the necessity of doing something about nuclear weapons in Iran. We all agree on the need to do some things, not necessarily do the same things. The question is, under the United States Constitution, who has the authority to do it? And there we have a serious difference of opinion. And I have to tell you, one of the lowest days in the time that I've served in Congress was the day that President Obama came to the House to give his State of the Union address before a joint session of the Congress. And at the end of his long laundry list of things that he wanted Congress to do, that every president has of either party, they always have a list of things they want done. At the end of his, he said, "And if you don't do it, I will." By what authority under the United States Constitution? And the reason why it was such a low day for me was that so many members of your party stood up and gave a standing ovation to the president when he said, "I'm going to take your power, the people's power, in the elected representatives of the Congress, and I'm going to use them for other purposes." Mr. Chairman, could I have an order?
Yes, the committee will come to order and recognize again the gentleman from Virginia.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'll focus my remarks on the recent deal the President struck with Iran on its nuclear capability, a deal that primarily meets Iran's goals in that sanctions are lifted, nuclear research and development continues, and America's safety is compromised, but doesn't include any requirements for inspections that can verify compliance anytime and anywhere. Amazingly, among the deal's many flaws is an end to a ban prohibiting Iranians from coming to the U.S. to study nuclear science and nuclear engineering at American universities. Knowledge obtained in these programs is instrumental in being able to design and build nuclear bombs. President Obama made these gutting concessions even as a senior State Department official testified before Congress that deception is part of Iran's DNA, and Iran's actions continue to prove that it can't be trusted. With that background in mind, President Obama's agreement with Iran is being unlawfully implemented because the administration failed to provide Congress with the documents required under the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act of 2015. Under that act, the agreement materials required to be submitted by the President to Congress, quote, include any additional materials related thereto, including annexes, appendices, codicils, side agreements, implementing materials, documents, and guidance, technical or other understandings, and any related agreements, whether entered into or implemented prior to the agreement or to be entered into or implemented in the future, end quote. Because the President has not transmitted to Congress various side deals related to the agreement, including side deals between the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iran, he can't have Congress's approval of the agreement as required by the Iran Nuclear Agreement Review Act. Yet the President pushes on unlawfully with his doomed agreement that can't protect Americans from a nuclear Iran. President Obama is unfortunately no stranger to bad deals. 2 years ago, this administration negotiated with the Taliban for the release of Sergeant Bo Bergdahl, a deserter who awaits court-martial. Despite having a policy of not negotiating with terrorists, the administration irresponsibly exchanged Sergeant Bergdahl for 5 Taliban terrorists detained at Guantanamo Bay. By doing so, the administration has emboldened all terrorist organizations and has created the risk that 5 terrorists will re-enter the field of battle. Making matters even worse, the President, again, violated federal law in the process, namely the federal law requiring 30 days' notice to Congress before the release of any terrorist prisoners from Guantanamo Bay. The Nonpartisan Government Accountability Office concluded that was a violation of a, quote, clear and unambiguous law. The GAO has concluded the President's actions constituted a violation of the Anti-Deficiency Act, which prohibits federal agencies from spending funds in excess of or in advance of amounts that are legally available. The Constitution does not and cannot require that presidents make sound decisions in office, but it does require that presidents obey the law. The President is sworn to do as much, as are we as members of Congress. And I look forward to hearing from today's witnesses.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Chair would now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Conyers from the rebuilding city of Detroit.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome the witnesses, and to my colleagues, the issue of appropriate roles of the Congress and the President is a subject of worthy of a general and a genuinely substantive discussion. And I think it's a very important discussion that's involved in the hearing today. For instance, we could consider whether our nation's current military operations against the Islamic State of Iraq and Syria have been properly authorized by Congress. I won't go into details, but I'm involved in research on that subject at the present moment. Unfortunately, today's hearings may be turning into an attack against the current administration. Let's start off with this proposition. Neither the Iran nuclear agreement nor the Paris climate change agreement is a treaty within the meaning of the Constitution's treaty clause that requires Senate consent. The Paris climate change agreement, for example, contains no mandatory quantitative emission standards or reductions. Rather, it is a strong exhortation that parties take concrete, transparent, but ultimately self-directed steps to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Contrary to the assertions of some, this agreement does not contain legally binding requirements, nor does it purport to grant new authority to the President to meet any such requirements. In short, it doesn't meet the traditional criteria of a treaty within the meaning of the treaty clause. And the Iran agreement was a set of political commitments rather than legally binding requirements. Thus, it also was not constitutionally required to be subject to Senate approval. In addition, both agreements are consistent with existing law of the United States of America. For instance, the statutes imposing sanctions on Iran for its nuclear weapons program also give the president the discretion to remove these sanctions should certain criteria be met. And the Paris Climate Agreement was reached pursuant to a 1992 climate change treaty that the Senate had already ratified. In other words, the Paris Agreement is consistent with the obligations created by a treaty that under the Supremacy Clause was already the law of the land. Now, as Professor Vladeck correctly notes, arguments questioning the legality of these agreements are part of an ongoing attempt to paint policy disputes as constitutional matters. Whatever one thinks about the merits of either the Iran nuclear agreement or the Paris Climate Agreement, the Constitution and historical practice make clear that the President was within his authority to enter into them. At any rate, Congress has already had the opportunity to make its voice heard. With respect to the Iran nuclear agreement, Congress had the chance to disapprove the agreement, but opponents of the agreement failed to obtain the necessary votes to prevent the agreement from taking effect. And as I noted and conclude, the Senate long ago ratified the climate change treaty pursuant to which the Paris Agreement was entered. So rather than sparking enlightened discussion, today's hearing, I fear, may be a string of partisan exercises by the task force. But I think it's important that we move on, and I thank our witnesses for appearing today. I look forward to their hearing their testimony, and I thank the chair.
Thank the gentleman from Michigan for his opening statement. And I'll now introduce the witnesses. Our first witness is Eugene Kantorovich, professor of law at Northwestern Law School. And our second witness, welcoming him back again, is Stephen Vladeck, professor of law at American University and Washington College of Law. And our third witness is Stephen Groves, a leader of the Heritage Foundation's Freedom Project. We welcome you all here today and look forward to your testimony. Each of the witnesses' written statements will be entered into the record in its entirety. I ask that each witness summarize his or her testimony in 5 minutes or less. To help you stay within that time, there's a timing light in front of you, and that light switches from green to yellow, indicating you have 1 minute to conclude your testimony. And when the light turns red, it indicates it's time to wrap it up. Before I recognize the witnesses, it's a tradition of the task force that they be sworn in. So to the witnesses, please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear that the testimony that you're about to give will be the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Thank you. You may be seated. Let the record reflect that the witnesses answered in the affirmative. I now recognize our first witness, Mr. Kantorovich. Please turn on your microphone before speaking, and you're recognized for 5 minutes. Mr. Kantorovich, thank you.
Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Cohen, Ranking Member of the Committee Conyers, and honorable members of the committee. It's a great pleasure to be here today to discuss these matters with you. I'll state one thing for the record. I have the pleasure to say that we are now the Northwestern Pritzker School of Law, and our generous donor would would be happy to hear me say that, I hope. So the executive, nobody would dispute, has vast discretion in foreign affairs. Discretion imparted both by the Constitution, which gives the executive a primary role in the conduct of foreign affairs because of the greater capacity of a single individual to enter into negotiations and conduct dealings with foreign countries, and also because Congress, on top of that already broad discretion, has given the executive vast leeway through statutes that allow for waivers and many other delegations of broad authority. However, Congress also has constitutional powers, core Article 1 powers, including the foreign commerce power, spending power, which can greatly affect foreign affairs. And when these powers are exercised in the realm of foreign affairs, they are no less valid and no less plenipotentiary because they involve diplomacy or matters involving other countries. Now, indeed, because the executive's power in foreign affairs is so broad, it's hard for the executive to overreach. It's hard. But that makes it all the more amazing and all the more worrisome when the executive does indeed overreach. Because when one has vast power, claiming even more is even more problematic. And I'm going to briefly mention two recent examples of what I see as such overreach involving two core Article 1 powers of Congress, the foreign commerce power involving the Iran Sanctions Act, and the spending power involving funding to certain United Nations agencies. As Chairman Goodlatte mentioned, the Iran Sanctions Review Act requires that the President transmit, as a condition for the sanctions relief that the Act enables, that the President transmit the entire agreement. The language of this provision in the Iran Review Act is extraordinarily vast, and it looks like it was written by teams of redundant lawyers. And it bears quoting again. These agreements include appendices, annexes, codicils, side agreements, implementing materials, documents, that's one broad category. So the question is this a document? Guidance, technical or other understandings, and lots of other stuff. The question is, are there relevant materials involving arrangements between the International Atomic Energy Agency and Iran for inspection and review of their nuclear program? Is that a document, material, codicil, and so forth under the deal? And it seems quite clear that it is. It's actually mentioned and incorporated by reference in the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action itself. And as such, it must be transmitted to Congress for the review period under the Act to begin. If that review period does not begin, sanctions cannot be lifted. It is true, as Ranking Member Conyers pointed out, that prior statutory sanctions had waiver provisions. But just as Congress can allow the President to waive, it can cabin and take back that waiver authority, which is exactly what happened in the Iran Nuclear Sanctions Review Act. As a result, the current lifting of sanctions is legally problematic, and even more troubling is the executive's apparent desire to leverage this to now intimidate states into abandoning their lawful sanctions, which again, the Iran Nuclear Review Act would prohibit. Now, a separate law involves Congress's exercise of its spending power. Congress can, through the power of the purse, deal with any subject involving diplomacy, involving war, as the chairman mentioned. And Congress provided that when UN agencies try to take sides in the Middle East conflict and improperly admit the Palestinian Authority as a member state, despite it not meeting the international criteria for statehood, those agencies can't be funded by the U.S. taxpayer. That law is quite clear, and it applies to any UN-affiliated agency. One such agency, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Control, has accepted the Palestinians as members. The clear effect must be that they cannot receive taxpayer funding. The executive seems to take the position that he will nonetheless send a check to this agency on the theory that the Framework Convention is a treaty. Now, it's true it's a treaty, but it's also an agency created by that treaty. And I think the best proof of that is a treaty can't deposit a check. Only a UN agency can deposit a check. So I presume the money from the Treasury isn't being sent to the treaty, it's being sent to the UN agency, and that's exactly what the law prohibits. Thank you, and I would refer the committee to my written testimony for further elaboration.
Thank you, Mr. Kondorovich, and now I'd recognize the gentleman, Mr. Vladek, for his testimony.
Great. Thank you, Chairman King, Ranking Member Cohen, distinguished members of the task force. It's an honor and a privilege to be testifying before you again. I do fear that it has become an all too common refrain in contemporary American discourse for those who object to the wisdom of particular policy outcomes to disguise that objection behind claims of legitimacy. That is, that the relevant government actor lacked the authority to effect the disputed policy outcome, never mind its wisdom or potentially its lack thereof. For example, when the Supreme Court interprets the Constitution in a manner some of us don't like, critics often object to the court's power to even reach the contested interpretation in the first place rather than the merits of that interpretation. In a recent essay, my friend and George Washington law professor Oren Kerr described this phenomenon, which he harshly criticized, as the politics of delegitimization. It seems to me that today's hearing is a variation on the same theme, portraying a range of perfectly legitimate substantive disagreements over various of the Obama administration's foreign policy initiatives as arrogations of executive power rather than merely as exercises of executive power with which many of us simply disagree. Indeed, of all the areas in which President Obama has been criticized for overreaching, foreign affairs may be the context in which those claims ring the hollowest. Not only does the Constitution invest the president with a wide range of inherent, and as the Supreme Court just reminded us in the Zivotofsky case, preclusive constitutional authority in the field of foreign affairs, but Congress has historically acquiesced by broadly delegating much of its own authority in this field to the president. Nor does the president overreach simply by entering into diplomatic accords without formally submitting the agreement to Congress. All three branches of the federal government have recognized, and shortly after the founding, that the president has the constitutional power to enter into bi- or multilateral agreements that are not treaties for constitutional purposes. Indeed, as the Congressional Research Service explained in a March 2015 report, these agreements, rather than treaties, have become the constitutional norm. With regard to the third category of these agreements, so-called sole executive agreements, as the Supreme Court explained in 2003, our cases have recognized that the president has the authority to make executive agreements with other countries requiring no ratification by the Senate or approval by Congress, this power having been exercised since the early years of the Republic. Indeed, although the extent of the president's authority to conclude executive agreements is uncertain, as one recent study concluded, the courts have never struck down a presidential executive agreement as being unconstitutional. Instead, the contemporary debate is not over the abstract validity of sole executive agreements, but rather the specific criteria that separate agreements agreements that ought not to be requiring congressional involvement from those that should. To be frank, there are no bright lines, but by far the two most important criteria for assessing whether the president should submit an international agreement to Congress are whether the agreement is inconsistent with and could not be implemented on the basis of existing U.S. law, and whether the agreement establishes binding legal rules or financial commitments with which the United States must comply. Unless the answer to both questions is yes, history, practice, and precedent all suggest that the president is acting within his constitutional authority when he enters into such a sole executive agreement. As my written testimony explains in more detail, I'm hard-pressed in light of these criteria to see the argument that my colleagues make that President Obama was constitutionally required to submit to Congress either the full Iran deal or the Paris Climate Agreement, for many of the reasons echoed by Jack Goldsmith and John Bellinger. Obviously, I'd be happy to say more about both of these lines of analysis during the Q&A. But apart from the merits of these debates, it seems to me that the more important point is the extent to which efforts to portray the foreign policy of the Obama administration as reflecting executive overreach are another example of the phenomenon described by Professor Kerr. Of course, this task force, this committee, and this Congress may think that there's more political and rhetorical gain to be had from casting these debates in legitimacy terms. But I fear that such an approach has deleterious long-term consequences for Congress's institutional role in the formation and supervision of U.S. foreign policy. After all, the more Congress focuses its critiques on ill-conceived legitimacy objections, the more it suggests, however implicitly, that all it is capable of in the field of foreign affairs is to offer such authority-driven objections to these policies, as opposed to either enacting legislation that more aggressively seeks to assert Congress's own foreign policy prerogatives, or taking a more active role in stimulating and raising the national level of discourse over the normative desirability of these measures. To me, Congress should be more careful going forward to seize these imperatives in the foreign policy arena. But as Professor Goldsmith has concluded, quote, I doubt Congress will be more careful in the future, since it typically doesn't like and cannot organize itself to exercise the responsibility of an equal constitutional partner in the conduct of U.S. foreign relations. Studying the origins and troubling persistence of that institutional shortcoming is, in my view, far more worthy of this task force time than trumped-up charges of executive overreach that, once subjected to meaningful scrutiny, smack of nothing more than the politics of delegitimization. Thank you again for the opportunity to testify before the task force this morning, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Mr. Vladek. The chair would now recognize Mr. Groves for his testimony.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for inviting me to testify today about executive overreach in foreign affairs. The debate over the proper scope of executive power in foreign affairs has been going on for more than 200 years. It arose during the 1793 George Washington presidency when he declared that the U.S. would be neutral in a war between France and Great Britain. The Monroe Doctrine, FDR's Destroyer for Bases Agreement, and the Algiers Accords are just a few historical examples where significant questions have arisen regarding executive authority in the conduct of foreign affairs. And here we are in 2016 continuing this debate. In our defense, it's not really our fault. The text of the Constitution, though fairly specific on the distribution of power in the domestic sphere, is less helpful in the foreign affairs arena. The Constitution was written to remedy certain pre-constitutional disputes, and as a result, we're forced to strain to find textual guidance to address many of the issues that arise today, particularly in foreign affairs. There is, of course, the Commander-in-Chief Clause, but most of the executive's foreign affairs powers have developed through historical practice over the past 2 centuries. To make things more difficult, for better or worse, the federal courts rarely intervene to clarify the limits of executive power in foreign affairs because such cases usually present non-justiciable political questions that courts are loath to answer one way or the other. But today I'd like to focus on the President's actions in the area of treaty making and how, in my view, he has overreached and even abused his authority. This task force has already heard testimony regarding the President's executive actions regarding immigration and health care that constitute overreach. In the foreign affairs realm, the President does the same thing, but through so-called sole executive agreements, as mentioned by Professor Vladek. Specifically, the President's decision to treat the Paris Agreement on climate change as a sole executive agreement was an overreach and an abuse of his executive authority. Never before has an international agreement of such import been treated as a sole executive agreement, not once in American history. The President himself stated that the Paris Agreement will literally save our planet. That's a quote. And yet the agreement somehow does not rise to the level of a treaty requiring the advice and consent of the Senate. The President's actions are an overreach for several reasons, first of which is that they fly in the face of a commitment made by the executive branch to the Senate in 1992. Back then, during the ratification debate on the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, the Senate was concerned that President Bush, or a future president, would negotiate follow-on agreements that had emissions targets and timetables, but not submit those follow-on agreements to the Senate. The Senate, then controlled by Democrats, required assurances that any such follow-on agreement containing targets and timetables would be submitted for approval. President Bush agreed on behalf of the executive branch, and the commitment was memorialized in the Framework Convention documentation during the ratification process. Now, the next president, to his credit, lived up to that commitment. When President Clinton negotiated the Kyoto Protocol in 1997, he treated it as a treaty, something that would have to go to the Senate for advice and consent. He didn't attempt to circumnavigate the Senate. He didn't ignore the 1992 commitment. He didn't simply declare the Kyoto Protocol was a sole executive agreement that didn't require Senate approval. He stuck to the commitment because that's what presidents should do. But President Obama is unwilling to live up to those commitments. And the Paris Agreement certainly contains targets and timetables, but the President refuses to submit it to the Senate. That is executive overreach. The President's actions also ignore the objective criteria used by the State Department in determining whether an international agreement is a treaty versus an executive agreement, the so-called Circular 175 procedure mentioned by Chairman King. As I detail at length in my written testimony, when the 8 factors of the C-175 procedure are applied, it's clear that the Paris Agreement must be treated as a treaty, but the President has chosen to ignore those factors as well as the 1992 commitment to the Senate. Now, because of this overreach, it will not likely be remedied in federal court. it's incumbent upon Congress to refuse to fund the implementation of the Paris Agreement until the people, through their elected representatives, approve it, and at a minimum, this House should refuse to appropriate U.S. taxpayer dollars for the so-called Green Climate Fund or any other financial mechanism associated with the Paris Agreement or the UN Framework Convention. Congress should also continue to resist and disapprove of all regulations meant to implement the Paris Agreement, such as the Clean Power Plan. Thank you again for inviting me to testify, and I look forward to any of the questions that the panel has.
Thank you, Mr. Groves. I'll now recognize myself for 5 minutes. And I would go directly to the way you culminated your testimony. And that would be your recommendation that if Congress, I'll ask it this way. When there's an executive overreach, in the case of, say, the Paris Agreement, for example, then it's your advice that Congress should refuse to fund it and use the power of the purse to restrain an overreach of the executive branch of government. Would it be your opinion that Congress do that whether or not we agree with the policy that's been negotiated?
Yeah, it should be dealt with, on its own merits. If for some reason there was a President Trump, or maybe it was President G.W. Bush who negotiated this Paris Agreement and treated it as a sole executive agreement, I would still be here testifying against it as a conservative. It's the principle of the matter that Congress and the Senate is being bypassed, and then they will come to you and ask for the appropriations, billions and billions of dollars a year, by the way, for this Green Climate Fund. So on the principles of the separation of powers and executive overreach, you should still defund this until it can be remedied, regardless of whether you agree or disagree with the President's views on climate change.
And your recommendation is that on the basis of the principle of the separation of powers and that doctrine, that even though Congress might agree with the policy, you would say defund that policy and say to the President, you must come to us because that's congressional authority. Don't step into our jurisdiction.
Correct.
Mr. Ladick, would you comment on that?
Well, I mean, certainly, Mr. Chairman, I would not disagree that Congress has the power of the purse, and that through the power of the purse, Congress has the authority to express its views on the wisdom or lack thereof of policy initiatives of the executive branch. And I don't think it is, I think members of Congress are free to use their votes to disapprove of policies they don't like through the power of the purse. The point I would just make briefly is that I think it's worth stressing that is a very different question than whether, in the absence of a no funds provision, the executive has overreached simply by going the executive agreement route over a treaty. But certainly the power of the purse is, I think, an obvious and long available option for Congress to assert itself in this.
Okay, but on the matter of principle rather than the matter of policy, would it be your counsel also that Congress should defend its authority to use the power of the purse, even if they agree with the policy, but there's been an overreach?
I mean, so I guess I would say I think it's up to the individual member to decide which is more important to him or her, which is to say, is it more important to assert the institutional prerogative of Congress or to support a policy choice that you agree with? And I think each member is going to make that decision for themselves.
So I would say Mr. Groves said principle, you said pragmatism. And I'd turn then to Mr. Kontarovich to settle this dispute.
I think principle is the long-term solution for Congress, because you're going to be in the
I'm going to be outvoted a lot today.
you're going to be in the same shoes. You're going to be in the same shoes again. And the important reason to take a stand in all of these cases, when you're going to be defunding something, it's going to hurt. It's going to hurt someone. It's going to run athwart some policy imperatives. But if Congress is unwilling to use this tool, it really can't expect the President to heed their wishes. Indeed, as we see with the continued funding of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Control, sometimes even defunding isn't enough to get something defunded. Sometimes even a no funds provision is going to be ignored. So what I would advise is that Congress needs to keep in mind that its legislation in the end is going to be interpreted by the President, usually in a non-justiciable context. The President will effectively be interpreting legislation designed to bind him. And so Congress should, if anything, overdo it in the direction of constraining the President, because don't worry, the President won't be over-constrained. The President will loosen whatever shackles are on him until he has comfortable room for maneuver.
Thank you, Mr. Kontarovich. Now, I'd start back down the line again to Mr. Groves, and I'd phrase it this way. even in the face of having a president who would, out of his desire to advance an executive overreach policy on climate change agreement like the Paris Agreement, if you have a president that you know will veto any legislation that uses the power of the purse to stand on principle. If Congress stands on principle, as you suggested, how does that principle stand up against a government that would be shut down and could not be opened up again with without a concession to the president, given that the supermajority to override a president's veto would be required?
You know, it's a dance that we've seen with these government shutdowns time and time again. But I would answer your question by referring to, Congressman Cohen's concern that in some time in the future we could be faced with a President Trump, and if Congress is intending on protecting its congressional prerogatives and its power of the purse, and having principled positions when a government shutdown is looming, now is the time to assert those, so that if and when there is a President Trump, you are not accused of mere partisanship, and you stood on principles that came out during this task force and its hearings.
Thank you, Mr. Groves. And I would say also that in this essentially a stare down between the Congress and the President, as the case may be, and you're faced with a government shutdown, the side that prevails will be the side that doesn't blink. And so if the public is very strongly behind the Congress itself and insists that we defend those constitutional principles that you've articulated, then it could be a different result in that kind of a showdown. And I think that's what's been the result of the shutdown we had in the past. I think it was a foregone conclusion that the president would not blink, and it was a foregone conclusion that Congress would. So I've just said, find me 217 others who will sign a blood oath that they will blink after I do. Thank you, and I yield to the ranking member of the task force from Tennessee.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. President Trump, putative, I guess, would wink and not blink. Mr. Kantorovich, I really enjoyed your presentation. The substance was good, but the delivery, the accent, and the style reminded me of my dear late friend Christopher Hitchens. He would not have a yarmulke on, although he did have some Jewish heritage, but he didn't necessarily believe in all that stuff. But you sound like Christopher Hitchens and bright. Tell me, how would you frame a statute that you think would solve the problem that you think exists? Because we've already got a Constitution that says X, Y, and Z, and we've got Supreme Court opinions, so what's a statute going to do?
So to speak generally across the different contexts we've considered, a statute would have fewer wiggle words, be more direct, and go in the direction of overbreadth. Congress, when it's legislating in the area of foreign affairs, is very conscious. It's self-consciously avoiding restraining the executive in ways which will be awkward for him or which will impair our diplomacy. And that's a salutary desire, except one has to remember that whatever Congress does, the executive is also going to interpret it more in line with his foreign policy objectives, and the executive will have the last word. So I would use broader, clearer language. So, for example,
broader, clearer. It doesn't broader, I thought you said simple and concise, more or less.
Yes, that's exactly right. So, for example, instead of saying UN-affiliated agencies, I would say UN agencies. Right? Take out the word affiliated. So each word is going to be used by the executive as an excuse for not implementing the policy that Congress has legislated. Fewer waivers would also be desirable. But most importantly, Congress needs to back its legislation, because in the examples I gave, Congress did, in fact, have very broad language, for example, about the required transmittal of documents under INARA. Congress has pretty clear defunding provisions regarding UN agencies and the Palestinian Authority. The question is Congress going to get angry about it when it doesn't happen? Because the question of funding the UN agencies, and whether this is a UN-affiliate agency or whether it's a UN treaty agency, is somewhat reminiscent, I might say, to broaden the partisan context here, of the Boland Amendment and the question of whether the National Security Council was a U.S. intelligence agency for purposes of laws restricting funds to the Contras. Now, when Congress considered that its directives were violated by the President, the President spent money without their authorization using statutory interpretation, Congress didn't just say, well, what are we going to do?
I can't remember. Which president was that?
That was Ronald Reagan.
Oh, yeah.
So I thought you would appreciate the broadening of the partisan context, sir, but I would remind you Congress's reaction. Congress didn't say, well, it's the president, it's foreign relations. It was a massive national question.
Well, I don't know how massive it was. Certain people thought it was, other people thought Oliver North should have been given a Congressional Medal of Honor. There was a split of opinion on the whole deal.
The hearings about the funding to the Contras, I think, were much more extensive than the hearings about the funding to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Control, though the amount of money in question was not too different.
Yes, sir. Mr. Groves, do you have differing opinions on how legislation would be framed?
Well, right now, the C-175 procedure, if everyone adheres to it, does the job. As I mentioned during the Clinton administration, they adhered to it. They knew the Kyoto Protocol was a treaty, and that's why they never even bothered to submit it. You have to really strike a balance between codifying some of these procedures to make sure that these things can be better understood between the two branches in the future, and stepping over the line between where the separation of powers are between the legislative and executive branch. But I think there's probably a middle ground where the current state of affairs with the C-175 factors and how it's decided whether to negotiate something as a treaty versus an executive agreement could be codified in a way that brings greater transparency to the process, and we can avoid some of these disputes in the future as we've had over.
And do you really think if we did that President Trump would give a hoot?
I don't know about him. He wasn't I wasn't on his team. I think the guy that I was backing would give a hoot. And I think that other well-meaning Democrats in the office would give a hoot. We have proof of it. President Clinton gave a hoot. And there were a number of things that he would have loved to have seen. He signed the Rome Statute on the International Criminal Court, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, a human rights treaty, and the Kyoto Protocol. He would have loved to see those things come into action. But he didn't pretend that they weren't treaties. He didn't pretend they were sole executive agreements. He adhered to his obligations.
And my time's expired, but I'm just curious who you supported.
I was on Senator Cruz's team.
Lion Ted.
No.
As distinguished from Short, this one, and whatever that one.
That gentleman's time has expired. And for the record, I know the whole truth of that, and that's not true.
I was just being facetious with the term.
Generally, I appreciate the tone of the gentleman from Tennessee, and now I'll recognize the gentleman from Texas for his testimony, his questioning.
Thank you, and I do appreciate the satire in satirically violating the rules of decorum of the House. Yeah, and I always felt it was rather satirical of somebody who had to be lying to say Lying Ted, or the most dishonest person he'd ever met, since he was the most honest man in the race. But let's go back to this Paris Agreement. And I appreciate, Mr. Kontarovich, your written testimony. You got into more detail that the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change accepted the Palestinian Authority as a state party. And as you say, the move is part of the Palestinian effort to be declared a state. The United States does not recognize the Palestinian Authority as a state, and U.S. policy has consistently opposed such moves. Therefore, longstanding U.S. law requires the defunding of any UN organization that grants Palestinian Authority such status. We also, I haven't read the Paris Agreement, but my understanding from reading articles about the Paris Agreement, the original Article 9 required developing nations to transfer wealth to underdeveloped nations, and normally that would require congressional action. So, and I know there was this great facade over the Iranian treaty. The Corker bill amended the Constitution with a legislative act by requiring a treaty to only get 1/3 of the vote of the Senate in order to be effectively ratified. I still think the Constitution's intact in that area, it should have required two-thirds to ratify what is a treaty, because it does modify a number of other treaties, like with regard to missiles and proliferation. So on the one hand, I appreciate the testimony. Clearly, if we're going to be transferring American wealth, with all due respect to the president's desire to spread the wealth, that's not something he has authority under the Constitution to do without congressional concurrence. And it also does explain why, after the Kyoto Accords, the underdeveloped nations were all claiming, if we don't get America on board, this agreement doesn't work. What they were saying was, if America doesn't sign on, then the one country that's going to send us checks is not going to be sending us checks, which is the whole reason we're part of this. We want to get checks from the U.S. Congress, from the U.S. Treasury. And so does anybody see a constitutional way of having the United States Treasury send money to the benefit of foreign countries without congressional concurrence in that? Anybody? Mr. Gross?
No, there actually is no way to do that. And
Constitutionally?
not constitutionally.
Yeah, apparently it's going on, like money being provided to Iran without congressional consent. But any other thoughts on that happening?
Well, I mean, the House did and the Senate had an opportunity during the omnibus to put in language strictly, specifically preventing the transfer of the $3 billion to the Green Climate Fund that the President had pledged.
Was there a need to put that in, since that they do not have authority to do that currently?
There was a need to put that in if you wanted to prevent the President from reprogramming other funds from other climate-related international aid areas into the Green Climate Fund, which is what he ultimately did in order to come up with the $3 billion that he had pledged.
Do you agree that the Senate should have taken a vote on the Iranian agreement as a treaty and determine whether or not they get two-thirds to ratify?
Well, I would defer to Eugene on the Iran nuclear deal issues. We've had debates within our circles about whether the Senate can just decide on its own that an agreement is a treaty and we're going to take a vote on it. There's good arguments on both sides of that issue. I think I agree with you. Whether the Senate can do that, there's good arguments. But I agree with you that the Corker-Cardin bill was, I think, a wrong-headed way to move forward, because you essentially turned a two-thirds advice and consent vote into a one-third.
Well, my time's expired, but I'm astounded that you think the Senate can call a cow a horse and then it becomes a horse. But thank you for your testimony.
The gentleman from Texas yields back, and the chair would now recognize the ranking member of the full committee, Mr. Conyers from Michigan.
Thank you, Chairman. Professor Vladeck, is the Paris Climate Agreement and the Iran nuclear deal inconsistent with current American law?
If they are, I'm not sure what those laws are. I mean, I've listened to my friends, Professor Kantorovich and Mr. Groves, and I haven't heard specific American statutes that these agreements are inconsistent with. Professor Kantorovich wants to suggest that failure to transmit the IAEA side deal of the Iran agreement violates the NARA, the Nuclear Agreement Review Act. I would just refer the task force to Jack Goldsmith's 2015 blog post on why that argument is intriguing but not convincing.
What say you, Professor Kantorovich?
My friend and teacher, Jack Goldsmith, wrote that blog post before he read my testimony and the full presentation of my argument.
Although he refers to you specifically in the post.
Yes, indeed. He read part of the material in his testimony, but not the fully elaborated argument. Again, I think it's important to point out, INARA does not require the president to transmit any deal. It's not a violation of INARA for the president to not transmit material. The president can say this material is sensitive, I don't want to give it over. That's entirely consistent with INARA. However, the consequence of that under INARA is that the sanctions, existing statutory sanctions, can't be lifted. It's not a violation, it just has consequences in terms of statutory sanctions. There's nothing unconstitutional about the president not transmitting this material. The problem is if the president wants to act as if the material were transmitted when, in fact, it was not. And I would refer the honorable members to the various statements of congressional intent made during the discussions of INARA, where it was quite clear that members understood they wanted to see everything to exercise their constitutional right to review the agreement.
Although that's not what the statute says. I mean, I think the problem is that I think Professor Kantorovich is right that one can find legislative history suggesting that everything was on the table. As I think Professor Goldsmith's post makes clear, if you actually read the text of the statute, there are certainly plausible, reasonable interpretations of the language that actually only refer to agreements to which the U.S. is a party, which does not include the IAEA side deal with Iran. I'm not saying that there's an obvious answer to this. My point is that I think we would need more of a smoking gun before reaching the conclusion that both of my colleagues reach, that these agreements are clearly inconsistent with existing U.S. law.
Well, let me ask you this. Has either the Paris Climate Agreement or the Iran nuclear deal created new legal binding commitments which our country must comply?
So I mean, my understanding of both, and I'm certainly happy to hear what my colleagues think, is that they create process commitments. They create reporting requirements, but that the actual text of the agreements was carefully negotiated to avoid binding substantive legal obligations entirely to avoid the U.S. constitutional law objections. Right? Indeed, there's a great post that I cite in my testimony about how the word shall was changed to should at the last minute for the emissions cap in the Paris Climate Agreement, entirely to avoid the very argument we're now hearing, that these agreements impose mandatory substantive obligations on the U.S. and therefore must be submitted to Congress.
Professor Kantorovich, do you generally agree with that assessment?
Yeah, I'm not as well read in the Paris deal, but I do not believe the Iran deal creates binding legal obligations for the United States, which is going to be extremely important when the administration argues that state laws must be preempted because of the deal, which is not something that can happen if it does not create binding legal obligations for the United States.
Let me raise this last question here. Opponents of the administration's policy claim that the president has exceeded his legal and constitutional authority in foreign affairs. But in what ways has Congress itself delegated its foreign policy powers to the executive branch?
Well, I think in the case of the Iran deal, I mean, I think it's quite clear that Congress in prior statutes had already delegated to the president a wide range of authority to figure out what the sanctions regime should look like, to set the terms of the sanctions, to control the timing of the sanctions. And so, you know, as Professor Goldsmith says, but for those delegations, I think we'd be in a very different position talking about how much authority the president already had to conduct the Iran agreement without Congress.
Do we have agreement on that generally?
It's exactly because Congress delegated such broad discretion to the president that limitations on that discretion, subsequent walkbacks of that discretion, and ways of monitoring that which INARA embodies need to be strictly construed.
Professor Groves, Mr. Groves, do you agree with that?
I would just speak as to the Paris Agreement. We have very specific things that the president didn't adhere to that demonstrate his overreach. The test is not whether there was a specific statutory law that the president has breached. That's a pretty high bar. What we have in the Paris Agreement is we have him ignoring the C-175 procedure, which decides what's a treaty and what's a sole executive agreement. We have him ignoring the 1992 commitment made by a prior executive to the Senate to submit future agreements with targets and timetables to the Senate. That is the basis, for my opinion, that President Obama has gone beyond his mandate when it comes to the Paris Agreement.
Thank you, Chairman King.
Thanks, gentleman from Michigan, and now I'll recognize another gentleman from Michigan, Mr. Bishop.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Appreciate your testimony today. Thank you very much for being here today. Mr. Groves, one of the questions I get from my constituents on some of these deals, and in particular the Iran deal, is how do we know whether an international agreement should be a treaty or an executive agreement?
Well, it's not. I wish it was set in stone, but it's not. I wish the U.S. Supreme Court had come down with an opinion laying out all the factors, but they haven't, and don't know if that's their role. What we do have is there were disputes over this back in the 50s. You remember things like the Bricker Amendment. You remember things like the Case-Zablocki Act, where the separation of these powers between Congress and the President were debated. And one of the things that came out of that debate and out of that dispute was the Circular 175 procedure, which gives 8 factors, which I detail ad nauseum, or at least at length, in my written testimony, which takes a look at the final Paris Agreement and element by element examines it to see if it meets those 8 elements. And it's my opinion is that they meet all 8 of them, not 1 or 2, not just 5 or 6, but all 8, I believe, are satisfied when you look at the extensive and comprehensive treatment of climate change that the Paris Agreement gives you. So my short answer would be the C-175 procedure is our best test for what's a treaty.
So how might Congress codify or clarify the treaty process to ensure that the Senate does have that opportunity to provide advice and consent?
Carefully. We want to be able to do so without breaching the separation of powers. We want to do so in a way that doesn't hamstring future presidents, Republican or Democrat, in making sound international agreements. I think, as I stated earlier, if it can be done in such a way that would foster transparency, it would half the job would be there. As it stands, the State Department does an internal procedure under C-175 and ultimately submits a memo to the chairman and ranking of Senate Foreign Relations. And that's the end of it. Very opaque. No one, I think, outside of those committee hearings gets to read those, and maybe sometimes they shouldn't because they might be sensitive. But when we don't have more transparency or more ways that both houses can kind of examine these things before it's too late, I think you end up with the disputes that we're having here today with the Iran nuclear deal and with the Paris Agreement.
Thank you very much. Mr. Kantorovich, can you explain to us what the current legal status is of the statutory Iran sanctions?
The statutory Iran sanctions, which have been embodied in numerous instruments, and Congress has passed many sets of Iran sanctions, almost invariably had provisions allowing the executive to waive or suspend or sunset them. Congress can delegate that kind of authority to the executive. By the same token, that which Congress giveth, it can taketh away or limit. In INARA, and this relates to Mr. Gomert's comment, Congress did a very unusual thing and flipped the majority presumption for congressional action, which is a significant deferral to the executive. That came at a price. The price was, until the review obligations were met by the President, existing sanctions which allowed for waiver could not, in fact, be waived. Because those requirements were not complied with, the previous waiver authority contained in legislative sanctions is now suspended. That is to say, just like legislative sanctions allowed for waiver, there has since been new legislation, namely INARA, which the President signed. Now, one might say, isn't it a bit much because of these IAE documents to limit the President's waiver authority? Again, that is not an inherent waiver authority. That's a statutory waiver authority which can be modified by statute. And if the President considers it very important, he could make these documents available. More importantly, state sanctions remain on the books. Some state sanctions are specifically authorized in the Comprehensive Iran Sanctions and Divestment Act of 2011, which does not give the President authority to waive or suspend them, unlike other sanctions. More importantly, INARA provides that its provisions do not in any way affect existing sanctions for Iran for human rights and other things like support of terrorism, which is what some of the state sanctions involve. So I would say that INARA locks in and protects from executive action state sanctions that aren't covered by SASADA, in particular those which deal with human rights and support of terrorism. Thank you.
Thanks, sir. Yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman returns to time, and the chair would now recognize the gentleman from Ohio, Mr. Jordan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Professor Kontorovich, good to see you again. I think the last time we saw you was in Israel last fall, so we appreciate you being here and the rest and the other witnesses as well. So let me see if I get this exactly right. This Framework on Climate Change Treaty actually, in a roundabout way, is circumventing federal law and allowing the State Department, not allowing, but they're usurping and violating the law and actually sending money to an organization that well, not even an organization. Roundabout way, they're getting money to this organization which recognizes the Palestinian Authority as a state. Straighten me out on what's exactly happening here.
Okay, so the funding restrictions in question block money from being given to the United Nations if they treat the Palestinian Authority in various ways as a member state.
Right.
One of those ways is accepting them into the various UN agencies. So the funding restriction says the UN doesn't get money. It's not money to the Palestinian Authority,
Right.
It's money to the UN agency.
Got
there
it.
are, in the Omnibus Spending Bill, various other restrictions about money going to the Palestinians if they join the International Criminal Court. Again, restrictions which I think were written overly narrowly in a way which make them easy to avoid. But this particular provision is about money to the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Control. And it's a great place, by the way, to take a stand on principle, the question we were discussing before.
Sure.
We're talking about $17 million. That's not going to break the climate. And it's not going to break the Middle East peace process.
Where's the State Department send the money?
My understanding is they send it to the administration of the UNFCCC, which is the secretariat, which gets the money and pays the bills for this UN agency.
Because in your opening statement you said there's a difference between you can't send money to a treaty, you have to send it to an organization.
So the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Control is a treaty which creates an organization. So the administration says, oh, this doesn't count as a violation of the statute because it's not an agency, it's a treaty. Now, it's true it's a treaty, but it's also an agency, just like the United Nations Charter is a treaty which creates an institution, the United Nations itself.
Okay, so a different subject. So you have that problem, I think a direct violation of the law we're seeing from our State Department. Then you also have this bit more, in my judgment, more fundamental problem where the Iran agreement was not treated as a treaty subject to the 2/3 requirement in the Senate for ratification. Do you agree with that?
So, no, I'm afraid I would not agree with
that.
Whether it's a treaty or not depends a lot on whether it creates obligations for the U.S., whether it trumps domestic law, and so forth. The President has told us that that is not the case. I take his word on it, and I think the courts in the future, if he would, for example, take action to preempt state sanctions, would hold him at his word. And I think it's important to maintain that this deal does not create any international or national obligations for the United States.
Okay.
That, by the way, also gives a lot more room to a future administration, for example, to deal with potential violations by Iran under this treaty.
All right.
Under this arrangement.
So last point I would make, Mr. Chairman, is we had this, it seems in my mind, we got the issue with the climate agreement and the dollars. You got the issue on the whole Corker-Cardin arrangement and what that was and how it moved through Congress. I think both of those are concerns. But actually one of the other big concerns is what we learned this week, which is this administration, with the Iran agreement, wasn't honest with the American people, wasn't honest with the press. So that's even, in some ways, even more of a fundamental problem. You cannot have people in positions, high positions in our government who aren't straight with the American people. You can't have them doing a con job, which is, based on what we've heard about Mr. Rhodes, is exactly what they tried to do. Mr. Groves, would you care to comment on that in my last minute?
Well, a lot of this goes back to what I've said about transparency. I mean, under existing procedures, when the State Department is going to open up a new set of negotiations about a new international agreement, it's under an obligation to go through internal processes under C-175 and notify Senate Foreign Relations about its intentions. What I do not know sitting here is if and when that notification went to Foreign Relations. Was it back with the hardliners in 2009, or was it when Ben Rhodes's spin and the picture he was painting for the press happened? That type of transparency is the type of thing that it...
Is that something formal that they're supposed to do, the administration is supposed to do with Senate Foreign Relations? And
Absolutely. It's all under this particular procedure, which arose from these types of disputes that happened back in the 50s when everyone was trying to rebalance
And
this.
do we not know if that took place, or do you not know?
I don't know what you guys have in your briefing.
Well, I'm just asking in a general sense. Mr. Chairman, that might be something we want to check out, see if they did what they're supposed to do. My guess is if they're willing to, not communicate in an honest fashion, they may not have done what they were supposed to do.
Yeah.
Something we should find out.
What I'm hearing about is the backtrack is these were non-governmental channels. These are back channels, and so they'll probably take the view, to the extent that this ever comes out, that it wasn't yet ripe to trigger notification of Senate Foreign Relations.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
And I thank the gentleman from Ohio, and Chair takes note of the remarks in this testimony, and as we compile a report, we will also review that topic. Chair now recognizes the gentleman from Idaho for his 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr.
Labrador.
Chairman, and thank you to the witnesses for being here today. Mr. Groves, can you briefly describe the difference between a treaty and an executive agreement?
Well, sure. The executive agreements are usually narrow. They're often bilateral. They don't require additional congressional legislation to implement them or additional funding from Congress. Their provisions can usually be executed in a fairly brief period of time. They're less formal. There are just a number of things that history and practice has done to separate the two, whereas treaties are comprehensive, lengthy, complex, with lengthy periods of time. Like the Paris Agreement is open-ended. There is no end to the provisions under it, including our obligations to fund the Green Climate Fund and other mechanisms to the tune of billions and billions of dollars.
So in your opinion, is the Paris Agreement a treaty?
I think on all fours it's a treaty. If you just look at the objective factors under C-175, you look at historical practice, you look at the commentary of legal scholars a lot smarter than I am, and apply that to the facts of the Paris Agreement, I think it's uncontrovertibly a treaty.
So can you briefly discuss Circular 175 or C-175 and the justifications that it gives to view the Paris Agreement as a treaty?
Say again, sir?
Can you discuss the State Department Circular 175 and whatever justifications it gives to treat the Paris Agreement as a treaty?
Yes. Under the procedure, they're supposed to send a memo, a comprehensive memo, to the Foreign Relations Committee in the Senate explaining why they're going forward in a particular way, why they're going forward as an executive agreement versus a treaty. I'm not privy to that memorandum or even know that it was sent or not, but I'd sure be interested in reading it because making the case for a comprehensive earth-saving international agreement, I'd like to see how that got fit into a sole executive agreement format, but I'm not privy to that memorandum.
So what steps or actions can Congress take in the future to ensure that a treaty negotiated by any administration, whether it's the Obama or the Trump administration or any other administration, follows the proper course of action and is properly submitted to Congress?
Well, we need to raise the level of the current state because it was just ignored by the president. If there's a way to codify it without breaching without breaching the separation of powers agreements, there are proposals that have been out there. There's a legal scholar named Una Hathaway who's given a comprehensive proposal on how we might approach this issue going forward, especially due to the huge propagation of executive agreements, congressional executive agreements, in lieu of treaties. So it's something that the Heritage Foundation and some of my colleagues there are exploring with the idea of proposing legislation in the future, probably not during an election year, but maybe thereafter, where both the House and Senate can codify, make this process more transparent, avoid these types of conflicts in the future, because the executive branch needs to know how much or little support it's going to have in future with a particular agreement. I think more transparency is the answer.
Maybe it might be a good idea to do it during an election year because we don't know who the next president is going to be. So maybe both parties can actually work together on something like this.
Sure.
What recourse does Congress have right now if an administration refuses to submit a treaty to Congress?
Well, it's got few recourses. It can hold hearings. It can raise the level of scrutiny. on what the president's doing. It can show the overreach. But when push comes to shove, its number one tool is exercising the power of the purse. And in things like the Paris Agreement, I'm not unsure about the Iran Agreement, but in the Paris Agreement, it pledges billions, tens of billions, probably over time, even more, billions and billions of U.S. taxpayer dollars to go and finance something called the Green Climate Fund, which is going to redistribute funds to climate change projects all around the world in developing countries. Congress has the absolute power to stop that money. Thus far, it has chosen not to do so, but I hope that hearings like these and task forces like these continue to keep the profile high on this so that when these funding measures come up again in the future, we can take a very close look at them.
Okay. Mr. Kontorovich, I think I'm pronouncing that right. What's the significance of the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change accepting the Palestinian Authority as a state party?
The significance is it shows that this agency, supposedly dedicated to climate change, has decided to embroil itself in Middle East politics and recognize as a state party an entity that does not meet the criteria of international statehood. They don't do this with, any other entity, with Puntland or Kurdistan. Under U.S. law, this means that the U.S. cannot fund the relevant United Nations agency of the Framework Convention.
Does this signal then a shift or a change in U.S. foreign policy?
U.S. policy has banned use of funds for this since the 90s. The fact that the administration is going to probably send them a check anyway, I think doesn't signal a shift of policy so much as what the administration might perceive as wiggle room in the relevant statutory language. But the executive has been lobbying Congress to get rid of these provisions entirely. And so Congress has to understand this is a negotiation with the executive. His policies are clear. It's clear what he wants. And Congress can assert itself by giving less of that, right, going in the opposite direction, so that there will be consequences for not complying with the law.
Thank you. I yield back.
Gentleman from Idaho returns his time. This concludes today's hearing. Thanks to all the witnesses and members for participating. Without objection, all members will have 5 legislative days to submit additional written questions for the witnesses or additional materials for the record. I thank the witnesses, I thank the members and the staff and the audience. This hearing is adjourned.